Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're especially appreciative of John Reid being with us today. For those of you that have not met John, he's a former CEO of Cable and Wireless. He's had 30 years of experience in telecommunications, including executive positions in Canada, the Caribbean, and Latin America. He served as president of Cable and Wireless's consumer division and chairman of the Bahamas Telecommunications Company. So, John, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, John, let's just jump right into it. We want to talk about what telecommunications looks like on the other side of this pandemic. So what do you think is the change in the economics of telecommunications, comparing after the pandemic to before the pandemic?
Sure. I'm just going to make sure my volume's up. Thanks again, Mark, for inviting me. Nice to participate. Well, obviously, my viewpoint is my viewpoint. It may not be shared by everyone, but certainly, in my experience and what I've seen over the past 5, 6, 7 years, even before I kind of semi-exited the industry, it's a challenging industry. We all know the reasons. We cite, most of us, whether we're consumers or professionals, cite 1 or 2 reasons. But the reality is, if we look at sort of global telecom performance, it's generally lagged as an industry. Numerous other industries, shareholder returns have been down. The cost of capital often exceeds the return on capital. And I think, stagnant revenue growth. And this is all due to a number of reasons, obviously. In Europe, it seems to be from what I read, what I experienced a little bit being part of the Liberty Global family for a while, it is overly regulated for good or for bad. Competition is fierce. And, we see that in terms of pricing and regulatory policy following through on acquisitions and the like. In North America, the regulation is still firm, but it's not as overbearing, it seems. And if I go to my own backyard, I guess in the Caribbean and Latin America, it's a fairly stable environment. So the stagnant revenue growth, though, was certainly evident long before I exited. And I guess if I'm more particular, if you look at the results recently of some key providers in the region, Digicel provided their financial results a few months ago on their last quarter of 2019. Didn't cite revenue as a private company, but EBITDA was 4% growth. Normally, if you don't cite revenue, that's probably not a good thing to cite, or you'd cite it. Liberty Global or Liberty Latin America recently announced their results, as did Millicom. Very tepid growth, 1 to 2% perhaps, varied by markets. And then we look at a smaller player in the region, AT&I, and they've seen revenue growth or seen revenue decline for the past couple of years. So I think overall, coming into this pandemic, it's been challenging times.
All right. Well, thank you. So let's just look ahead then. Let's look to, say, for example, to 2022. What do you think this industry looks like?
I wish I had a crystal ball, but certainly coming out of this, and I think one of the things that's uncertain is how, obviously, what we read and what we experience, how long the pandemic lasts, and to what extent, and whether as they like to call it, the professionals, the financial analysts, and even politicians, whether it's a V-shaped sort of return, is it a swoosh return in terms of the economy? That really does then depend or impact on the financial performance, even within the telecom industry. Although that being said, the telecom industry tends to do okay during downturns. I mean, this is a traumatic event globally. But we did have a pretty significant downturn in 2008, obviously. And through that whole period, telecom companies in different parts of the world obviously had varying performance, but overall shored up pretty well compared to others. So I think what we're seeing already, and I think this sort of is an indication as well, and this will impact into 2022, because 2020, we're almost halfway through, and there's no real certainty as to, again, how the economy responds. Millicom, as I indicated, have announced dividend cancellations, capex reductions, opex reductions. Digicel, we don't know, but their balance sheet it's very challenged at almost 7 times levered. So they've got a big financial balloon in 21 anyway, regardless of the pandemic, of a $1.2 or $1.3 billion repayment, which is probably refinancing. But they're in a very, certainly in a tenuous position. And Liberty Latin America has announced capex reductions, opex reductions, and so we're seeing that. And that was 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it wasn't even 2 to 3 months after. So the focus on liquidity, sort of balance sheet health, and sort of managing that, will certainly determine the winners and the losers, but also that's probably sets up 2022 when we hope things are back to normal. Normal investment sort of begins, 5G ramps up again. But I think between now and then, I think there's a lot to happen.
So when you look at that 2022, and let's say that the dip, if you will, caused by the pandemic is over by then, do you see the same kind of robust competition in 2022 as you were seeing in 2019? Is the nature of the competition different? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think globally M&A is going to pick up over the, it's already starting. We've seen a couple of deals. We saw Liberty Global and Telefonica strike a huge deal in the UK just last week. A couple of weeks before that, a smaller deal will sort of tell you that I think, companies are looking at the world a little different in terms of Verizon buying a video conferencing company for only $500 million, a small acquisition. But I think we're going to see companies look a little different over the next couple of years. Now, some of these fully integrated, companies are beasts anyway, whether they're Verizon, AT&T, or others. But when you get down to more pure play or sort of maybe not as expansive asset-based companies, then I think you're going to see those companies sort of venture outside the normal M&A activity. I think you'll see, again, similar to how many cable companies and telcos bought IT and business solutions companies over probably the last 10 to 12 years. There may be a move more then into, again, video conferencing, logistics companies, supply management, just to lever off that, but also manage the risk. I think in terms of competition, depending on where you are in the globe, I think you'll still see a push for fixed mobile convergence. That's still going to play out. There's certain parts of LATAM that will no doubt consolidate, less so in the Caribbean. There's not a lot of players, as we all know. If we include Mexico, there's a likelihood there that some consolidation takes place. I'm not as well versed, obviously, in Africa, but I think the move to fixed mobile convergence, but then adjacencies will pick up as well. And what will push that, Mark, I think, is not just traditional M&A activities, is because there are some balance sheets are going to be a lot weaker coming out of this than going in.
So the pandemic has changed how people have used telecommunications. And as you were just talking about, through some of the M&A type activity, we're seeing companies that vertically integrate more. What kinds of new services are you expecting that we'll probably see, or at least services that'll grow as greater than we'd anticipated, say 2 or 3 years from now?
I think if we're looking at the industry, then 5G is obviously going to, and there's different viewpoints on this in terms of how far 5G will be set back, or in fact, because of the likely revised business cases that are coming out of the pandemic and sort of being proven maybe through the remote learning and telehealth and the like, that perhaps that accelerates it. Certainly there's supply management issues and obviously economic issues, but those healthy companies I think will push on. I think that will drive a lot of innovation, application development. I think if you bring it down to more of a narrow geographic focus, or even within some of the larger assets, it's going to be probably less so much about new services, more building on what's out there right now, but a focus really on the network itself, the resiliency of the network. I think whether it's from a regulatory perspective, a political perspective, or just companies themselves coming out of this pandemic and so far doing a pretty good job from all, I think we give them, most of them, very good marks on their performance, but their importance to society. And I think that importance to society, whether it's a pressure or just an understanding that, for commercial means as well as, country needs, we have to ensure that our networks are resilient, reliable, and robust. So that means capacity as well as coverage. And I think that will then spawn the continuous growth of new services. So I'm not as convinced over the next couple of years, apart from, virtual reality, augmented reality, more gamification, gaming, and the like. Certainly as 5G picks up, we're going to see a transformative, impact on the globe. But in the short term, I think it'll be, picking up the pieces and trying to build networks to support those services.
So you've talked about the financial statements of different types of companies. And you've talked about the need for investments in networks so they can support the different services. One of the things we've observed over the past several years, if you look at finances of the network operators versus the edge providers, if you will, so the Facebooks, the Googles, and even some of the device providers like Apple, the people on the edge, the apps, the devices, they've gotten very cash rich. A lot of cash has flowed in relative to the amount of investments they've had to make. If you look at the network operators, they've been going into debt. They're not financially imperiled from that, but they've been going into debt to build the networks that all these others can use. And so that's, in some sense, that's an imbalance in the amount of cash that different companies have for investment. Do you see that changing after the pandemic?
That's a great question. As a cable operator, telco operator, I'd love to see it change. It's been a great debate for a long time. You know, there's a lot of viewpoints on this, and certainly, you know, freedom, regulatory freedom, liberalization, net neutrality, everything comes into play. But if you go back to what I started out by saying, that, you know, the challenges are pretty significant in this industry, and not every company can be like Comcast and you know, buy NBC Universal and you know, continue to buy Sky and sort of build vertically as well as horizontally. A lot of companies struggle, and I think they struggle, as you indicated, because the networks had to be still built to support the services, and the demands and the capacity, it just doesn't decline. It really has to come down to it seems, to a political and regulatory will to deal with it. And I think, you know, I believe something will come out of this, if it's just further discussions, consultation, think tanks to identify opportunities to continue to build this network, build the capacity, reach, and again, we are just talking about the network that reaches people today. And we know that there's a significant population that can't access even basic services. And I think if the government and regulators sort of can look at it from that perspective and what's required to meet that capacity as a societal need, then that discussion then should extend into how do we allow the operators who are taking the risk, and obviously they're not enjoying significant returns at this time, certainly not over the last several years, to enjoy some of that, perhaps with sort of gateposts, or, you know, whether it's utility structure, I wouldn't want to venture into that discussion, but certainly some sort of a rate of return that allows them to, you know, to build those networks. And I think, listen, we know the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples, many people own those shares and do well off them. But that being said, they have balance sheets that can buy countries. And I think that that's just an indication that, one, the industry probably missed the boat themselves on developing that technology. But I think the gate is open, and I think it's a struggle unless governments really take hold of it.
All right, well, thank you. I would like to remind our audience that in about 3 minutes, we'll start taking questions from the chat room. So you put your questions over in the chat bar, then I'll be moderating that discussion. After about 15 minutes, then we'll have something more of an open mic, like Samantha described a little bit ago. So one more question before we do that, John. Mm-hmm. If you were a government official, a regulator, communications ministry, whatever that might be, what would be keeping you up at night?
Well, you know, this is the discussion for competition, or, you know, the many sides of that discussion is for another day. But I would probably think of, because that understanding or that perspective is that there's not enough competition. I would think that keeps a government official up at night, and how they think they can, I guess, facilitate new entrants. I would also suggest that government officials shouldn't worry about that as much as worry about how do we work with telecom players in the market to make what we would probably consider now a universal service of broadband, you know, accessible to everyone. And I think that related to that, or related, you know, to both, would be that I would probably be worried a little that the lifeline, and perhaps not just the financial health, but the well-being of residents and businesses of my particular country are largely being managed, or certainly facilitated, by a third party. And I think that would probably be number one, is that they rely on telecommunications, which become even more critical, that we would all recognize, I think. And I think first and foremost, as a political figure, I would like to at least know that I can control some of that myself. And under the current structure, of course, they can't.
So tell me what you mean by third party. You said you'd worry about that being controlled by a third party.
The telecom parties, the cable wireless, the Digicel, they really, if you think about it, they control the capacity, the coverage, the robustness of the network, the reliability of the network. When it comes down to health and financial health and people's well-being, the government can only put policy in place, provide supplements or subsidies, build society. But at the end of the day, we discovered during this pandemic is that the telecommunications companies have been really good partners, but that means that you're relying on somebody else to really, manage the health of your entire country in a sense.
Yeah, and that gets complicated because you have to be very comfortable with having relationships with people who are outside the country and maybe have different motivations than you do, or different aspirations for the country than you do. But what would be your advice for them as they try to have that relationship, make that relationship go well? Again, you're sitting in that seat of the Minister of Communications, the head of the regulatory agency. How do you think about that relationship and how do you develop it well?
To me, my whole career has been about a focus on people. And a lot of Caribbean nationals, and I can speak more clearly there, obviously, and even Canadians, it is about the relationship form. People can say that, but how you live that in your lives. I think the issue is there's a lot of historical negative aspects to this, whatever relationship. Cable wireless, for instance, has been in the Caribbean and other areas, obviously, for 100+ years. And I think that sort of created certainly created a lack of trust. A lot of regulators are actually former employees of the company, and often that's also creates complications. I think just the fact that, from my experience and what I've seen, and again, I come from a very small country, island in Canada that was also a British colony, but the fact is that I think there's just this overhang, regardless of how long it's been, is that there's this feeling of still being colonized. And don't forget that a lot of these countries only became certainly their own entities in the 60s. And so I think that's part of it. And then when you get down to two players, you start with trust, but then you realize you only have two main players in a lot of these markets. So how do you solve that? First, you identify what's the most important thing for you to resolve. And often that's not too different than the other individuals across the table. And then you start from there and how you can sort of, build that bridge. Relationships, as you know, Mark, are no different in the office or between third parties than they are with your own sort of personal relationships. They had to be watered. They had to be, they had to be attended to. They had to be honest and transparent. And sometimes the objectives certainly are different, and the metrics are different in how you achieve success. But often there's a way in the middle to do that. What I would say the additional complication, though, is that in this part of the world, there's not one single regulator like there is in Europe, like there is in the US, and there is in Canada. So having different regulators and different governments and different objectives and priorities, that hampers growth, because from a commercial perspective, you want to deal with one individual, one entity to try to resolve some of these issues which are similar across borders. So, but it does take the time, and they do, through Canto and other organizations, facilitate that, but it really needs to be developed.
So again, I'll remind the audience, please ask any questions over in the chat bar if you would like to. I am not seeing any yet, so I've still got lots of questions more, John, so you'll have to put up with me until we start getting some good questions from other people. You talked about the importance of broadband universal access going into the future. Tell us where you have seen that done well. What are some things that people have done well in the past? And then how do you think some of those practices are changed by the pandemic?
Well, I haven't worked in a market where universal access has been in place. I know it does exist in other countries, and I haven't really followed the success from a business model perspective or social policy perspective. But I know that it's just an extension, the pandemic, of what a lot in certainly in liberal countries uh, also discuss in terms of a universal income. So it's a different form of that, obviously, but there has always been, whether, and it's in the U.S. and it's in Canada and it's in Europe, that there's a push to certainly focus on those less served, and to find opportunities to at least give them a baseline of living, I guess, as it were. And I think that, now we have seen, what we have seen, of course, is that different commercial ventures on lifeline packages, as they call them, and certainly, reduced based on income levels in the US, and no cable companies used to do that. But at the same time, I think the discussion really needs to take hold. And I think then that discussion really comes down to how do we cost effectively not just reach these individuals, and some are within the urban sort of, the dense areas of a country's footprint. But the problem, of course, is extending that footprint cost effectively. Does 5G make that more cost effective? Well, it's still an investment, of course, and regardless of how that asset rolls out, it will start in sort of large, dense areas where the business cases kind of hold up. And the business cases coming into pandemic are certainly still a little speculative. But I think the time is right. I think the time is right. And the challenge, of course, is that it's difficult when you're discussing levels of service of ubiquity, and how those financial models work in countries where there's not a lot of wealth. And again, I talked about the challenges within the industry. Business models can be made to, with lower margins, and to ensure that that the lights stay on, for sure. And I think that's critically important. But it does make it more challenging from a PPP perspective, even when there's not a lot of dollars to invest. So, there are international organizations that support those initiatives, and I think perhaps that's where the discussion should be.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Emmanuel. Emmanuel's from Ghana. He's with the National Communications Authority. He asks, what should regulatory authorities in developing countries, such as Ghana, do differently post-pandemic relative to what had been done before to support growth in the industry?
That's interesting. Well, I think from my perspective, the first thing I believe, and I think that's a good question, because I believe that the focus should be less on, do we have enough competitors? Rather, it should be, how do we facilitate expansion, capacity, coverage, customer experience? That should be the focus. You hold the service providers accountable. There are metrics, there's SLAs from a government perspective, I suppose, that could be established. So what I would suggest that governments do and regulators do is, again, what I used to do personally, actually, whether it helped or not, I can't tell you, Emmanuel, but when I lived in Trinidad, I would actually meet with the Telecom Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. I did it for my last 2 years there, and actually outline our capital expansion plan for the year, so that because they obviously address a lot of consumer and business queries, complaints, and concerns about the infrastructure and the plans of a company. And so we would go through that, identify our priorities, sort of bounce those off the regulator to ensure that they kind of align with some of their own social policy initiatives in terms of infrastructure expansion and community well-being. So I think the first thing that you can do is certainly engage the operators in your particular country, in Ghana, to identify what they believe are the priorities. And again, sometimes they're not as far removed from your own particular ones. It does come down with dialogue, and then facilitation. It's always a balance. I mean, I was on a call, a webinar from a community college that I was involved with in St. Lucia last week, and there was a gentleman from Digicel speaking on a panel before me, and he spoke about what the company is doing during the pandemic to support, which of course he would. But then he did talk about sort of the challenging, the challenges on regulatory fees, and the other ways that he felt that could facilitate growth if governments looked at their priorities and sort of how they generate revenue from operators in a different way that perhaps can be turned back into developing the networks and the infrastructure. It's a slippery slope in terms of not wanting to take the revenue. I can appreciate that. But at the same time, universal funds in some countries have created those opportunities to share the wealth and obviously identified through a third-party universal service plan mechanism to deploy those resources. So I would think it starts with dialogue, understanding the priorities of of what your competitors believe are important to them, and they probably won't be much different. It's about growing their business, which often means extending the network and bringing on new customers and bringing on certainly new services. But in this day and age, because the challenges on revenue are so significant, network build out is still important. And then identify, again, from a regulatory perspective, how can you work with them to facilitate that through maybe some fees or some supplements, even to the consumer level. At the same time, understanding that your vision is a long-term vision of the country in terms of social policy development that supports, but it really is underpinned by a foundation of infrastructure in this regard.
Well, your answer reminded me of an example that we had here in Florida many years ago now. We had a regulator, her name was Julia Johnson, and this is back when we regulated telecommunications in Florida. We don't anymore, but at that time we did. And when Julia became chairman of the Regulatory Commission, she started a practice of once a year bringing together the CEOs of the electric utilities, water, telecommunications, and some key politicians and a token academic. I was the token academic. And all we talked about was, what do we want for Florida? What do we want Florida's telecommunications to look like in the future? What do we want the electric system to look like in the future? Water. So it's all that very forward-looking. And so what it helped do was create a common vision of what the future should look like. And it got people out of the problem of looking at the next step and fighting over the next step, because it got us into the mode of thinking, okay, we know where the journey's supposed to go. All we have to think about are what are the different paths that can get us there. And it really helped resolve a lot of issues. And you're talking about the building of relationships, talking about what things should be like. Just reminded me of that example. She did that quite well. We have another question from Johannes Bauer, and it has two parts to it. He wonders how do you see the pandemic affecting the investment in 5G? Is it going to go faster, go slower? And then thinking ahead, if we're going to see these kinds of crises in the future, how do you think the investment or the rollout of 5G affects our abilities to respond?
Good questions. I think on the first one, I probably breezed over it when I answered, or when I referenced it earlier. The supply chains are interrupted right now, and Verizon had plans in the U.S., for instance, I think to within the year and a half, to have the country pretty much enveloped in 5G. There's still handsets will be available, 15 or 20, and so certainly from a consumer perspective, business perspective, those are absolutely critical. You can't have a network and then not be able to use it. I think the expectation, though, generally, one is that the GSMA has forecasted 25% less connected devices into the 2020 handsets than originally envisioned. Although Japan and China are certainly ramping up and have indicated they're going to reach their targets, I think we'll see it a little bit less. My thinking is, it goes back to the first point which we talked about. How long does it last? I think that's the big wild card right now. If we have a second wave of this, I think everything is off the table. From a financial perspective, companies are taking massive hits, certainly in the long term if that happens. And I think that's really, and you're seeing even the smaller companies like Liberty Latin America, like Digicel, like Millicom, sort of already making balance sheet changes or operational changes to bring back their spending. Now, on my expectations that 5G is not going to be very ubiquitous or even introduced in most of these markets in the next couple of years anyway. So it probably has no impact in terms of developing countries, because it's probably more of a test and kind of grow and to put a flag in the ground, as many of us like to do sometimes. But I think there's no doubt that I think in the short term, we'll probably see some step back. And also, don't forget, they need spectrum. And in some countries, and particularly in Europe, they've holding off on spectrum auctions. So, I mean, there's so many pieces to this that I think, it's a massive investment, because it's not an overlay on 4G. It's a massive investment. So to do that, the business cases, which again seemed a little certainly skeptical as of now, until again, IoT and some other things, machine to machine sort of ramp up, and perhaps extension to rural parts of the country. then there's a lot to come together to make this business model work. And I think in a time when balance sheets are maybe a little bit strained, when focus is on cash, it will probably be more directed to ensure the resiliency of the network. In the long term, 5G is from all accounts and everything that as an industry executive I would have read, it's going to have a phenomenal impact on our industry. The questions, how much as a supplement rather than replace fixed line is always a great topic. But fixed line, the backhaul is still required. Companies are building massive 1 gig networks, and they do exist, by the way, in certain parts of developing world in which we operate. So I think in the long term, not even the long term, in the midterm, short 5G will pick it up again. And again, it depends on the country and how fast they come back from this pandemic.
Okay, so a lot of the things that you've talked about have to do with investing in 5G, investing in all the different types of infrastructure going forward. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind describing, when you were the CEO, you had to determine what that investment decision was like. You had to determine how much capital was the company going to invest this year, and how is it going to be allocated across different types of projects. Would you mind describing just how you thought about that, what that process was like, so that people kind of get an inside view of, this is where it comes from?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to note on our process, and it's probably very similar to most, is that we have an internal competition, obviously, to scarce resources. And I'll give you the example that I think in 2015 or 16 in cable and wireless, we invested about 400 million one of the years. The initial proposals from the various departments and what they felt were absolutely critical capital investment were $2.2 billion. So you start from a very big pool, you send people back, but it's a competition. And that's a competition who has the prettiest PowerPoint presentation. It's a competition is, what is critical to be done. That's sort of priority number one. What we think we need to do, and then what's nice to have. And it really goes in those levels of importance. You build business cases based on every scenario. You don't build them on, you build business cases on fleet management replacement only because you know that you're going to spend X amount on maintenance and over the next 3 years. And so you build in a sort of replacement model for your vehicles. You build in, obviously, business cases based on network expansion, network coverage, based on usage and ARPU. And it really is down to the penny, because it was interesting. It's interesting anecdote, but I always felt we dealt in pennies, more so in the old days. When I looked at ARPU, it was always $15.67, $15.21. And if you take 50 cents and you multiply it over thousands of customers, and you do it over a year, well, that's a lot of cents. So it really comes down to scarce resources. I will also tell you that we would have a saying internally. This was my old, it wasn't cable and wireless, it was an old companies I used to work for. But I have a feeling that companies still look at this, and particularly in areas where you do have decisions to make and choices. Capital gets deployed where it's the most welcome. In other words, what does the country, what's the relationship with the country? What's the relationship with a particular regulator? It's not that you're punishing people for not developing or not investing, because you always invest in every country. But when it comes down to particular projects, opportunities to invest, when you look at business models, sometimes that are very similar, it's natural to put capital in countries where you know that you've got a good relationship, or you have a relationship that's probably neutral. But if it's negative, if there's a feeling of mistrust, and from both sides, then that will keep capital out of the country for sure. There's no doubt about it, but only in the extent that you have capital to deploy in decision, and there's scarce resources like any household budget, and you never have enough that you want to invest. Certainly, there's always a 3-year plan and investment, and there's always choices to be made. So I'd say, Mark, that it's done at a micro level. It's done with internal competition, and it's done looking at the opportunities within a particular country or jurisdiction, and hope that you have a really good relationship that's not going to cause any impediment to the deployment of that capital.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So, Sam, I think we're ready to open up the microphones. We've had Sherman has had a question typed up in the chat room for a while, so perhaps we could start with him. But you're in charge, so I'll leave it to you.
Sure, thank you very much. So yeah, so right now this is going to be our sharing experience portion of our session. So we did have a few questions, and please forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Tiago, it looks like had a question. So if you're okay with sharing through audio, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your audio, and if you'd like, please go ahead and ask your question. Tiago, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. My question is about if this increasing sense of essentiality of the broadband networks, as we are seeing now through this pandemic, will somehow speeding up the commoditization of the telecom sector. I mean, the differentiation, the competition is becoming less important, would be becoming less important, and the reliance and the capacity of the networks would justify like some kind of leniency from the regulators of having less competition, maybe some natural monopolies that could increase margins of telecoms, margins that are being drained by OTTs, by over-the-top applications in the past years, as a way to sustain the investments in capacity, in reliability of the telecom sector. And in this way, the regulation of the telecom operators would be more similar with the other utilities like electric and water operators.
Okay. I want to make sure that I understand the question, Tiago. You're wondering whether the model changes from a regulatory perspective to facilitate continued investment through relaxing the competitive framework or the regulatory oversight. I just want to capture it all. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, the question is more focused on the position of the regulators. We are seeing that the regulators worldwide in the telecom sector differ a lot when we talk with regulators of water, of electric, of utilities, because in telecom there's a very competitive environment. And my question is, with this pandemic and with the increasing sense of essentiality of the networks, this could drive the regulators to a direction on they become more interested in having more capacity and having more more investment in networks and less competition, as we have in electric sector, in water and utilities and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there's within the industry itself, we've often reflected on whether, the classification of a certainly from an infrastructure perspective, what does a telecommunications network, how does it rank, or how does it stack up against other utilities? Only from the perspective, at some point, do we become a quasi-utility? Now, there's a lot of positives and negatives, I guess, to that in some respects. But to your point, I believe that from a regulatory perspective, going forward, and how this impacts competition is another point in some respects. But let's focus on competition, but focused on, again, the 3 C's, as I would call them, is coverage, capacity, and the customer experience. The customer, of course, is universal. And so what that allows the regulators to do is really, it doesn't choose winners or losers, and it doesn't create overbearing regulatory kind of oversight on the operators. It certainly encourages investment, and it encourages certainly the competition with you're right, with the commoditization of the network, and it has become commoditized coming into the pandemic. It's not about the fastest network anymore, because I can tell you, as soon as company A upgrades its network, company B is not too far behind, whether it's mobile or whether it's a fixed line service. It becomes less about the services themselves, because again, when it comes down to the services, they're almost always the same. You choose different TV networks for the most part, but the core networks, when it comes down from the perspective, is the same. Your broadband services are obviously the same in terms of what a customer can do. So what it comes down to really is how much of that coverage is available, what the capacity of that coverage is, and what's the experience. You may see at some point more of an increase in companies sort of creating separate assets to deal with infrastructure, and then separate assets to deal with the sort of delivery of the services over that network. I know there's some countries that have open networks, and I don't know the success of those, except I do understand, certainly the model to know that it certainly becomes less about the competitors and more about, how well we do as a company, and that how well that secures our customer base. So I think from a regulatory perspective, it shouldn't be about the number of competitors. It should be about, how we can encourage investment, how we can encourage innovation, and how we can ensure that the coverage of the services that are so critical to our countries are realized. And I think it may be a different perspective coming out of this.
Okay, thank you.
Sam Shernan has a question.
I'm sorry?
Shernan has a question or comment.
Yes, we're going to Shernan right now. Shernan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Yes, okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes, hello to all. Hi, John.
Hey, Shernan.
So we know that operators are facing a hard time right now. I mean, they are competitors. They're trying to survive.
Yeah.
But how do you think they should, let's say, collaborate in order for them to survive? Although they are competitors, but how should they collaborate right now in this COVID-19 thing in order for them to survive?
I think, and I can say this, I haven't worked for anybody in 2 years. As I like to say, I have no horse in the race. I think particularly in small countries, collaboration, shared network, the opportunity to really reduce your own capital investment costs while allowing you to stretch those dollars that you do want to invest goes further for your company, goes further for the country. You compete again, if at some point the network is only going to matter in terms of its resiliency and its capacity. If we believe that regardless of the state of competition, that investment will take place regardless of the form, then certainly, sharing those networks and then focusing as a competitor in terms of, if I'm selling a product to you or a suite of service to you as a business owner, as a resident, I have to do the best that I can do in terms of the price point, the product set, obviously the reliability, the delivery of service, the responsiveness of it, the security of the service. And that kind of takes a lot of pressure off the balance sheet. But I think the collaboration needs to start from that perspective. You start from a high level, and that's difficult to do. I will tell you, there's not a whole lot of trust in most countries where I work between operators, and yet it does happen. We've seen a little bit more trust, for instance, in Canada between Bell and MTS. They do a shared network in certain parts, East and Western Canada. And that's just one example. So I think the collaboration is absolutely essential. And I'm not one who believes that the industry is all of a sudden going to miraculously figure out how to grow revenue by 5 and 7 and 8% again. I just don't see it. I know in the Caribbean and Latin, people only have so much, in developing countries, people don't have so much money to spend. If you raise the price, they're just going to spend more. If they're going to spend $20 a month on a prepaid mobile plan, they're going to spend $20 a month, regardless of what that is. They may take less, but they're going to spend $20. So when it comes down to the challenges of the top line, you're expanding your product set, obviously offering bundles, which reduces your churn perhaps, that not as many people are interested in as in the past. You can see some very nominal growth. It comes down, that's why companies are focused on the middle of the income statement, as I call it. It's the middle, it's the guts of the company. It's how many staff I have, it's how efficient that I run this company. It's, what can I do without? And I think, funny enough about this pandemic, that'll actually lead companies to more solutions than they realized they had. So whether it's remote working or something. I was thinking the other day that in some companies, perhaps a meeting with the only times a company that employees get together in some industries is for a social event, is actually a company event. It's a quarterly company party. It's a company, it's a company event to recognize milestones. at some point, some companies can, their employees can work at home probably for 90% of what they do. So again, the collaboration is absolutely critical, and I think it's more critical in countries where there's not a lot of wealth, where there's only a couple of players, and the challenge of investing and extending the network without a real economy of scale is a good incentive to collaborate more. And then the winner does sort of, there are winners and losers, but it comes down to how well my company does to provide the services that you want, not so much as to how the network performs because we're on the same network.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, John. So I'm going to go ahead and go to David Cox right now. David, I'm going to unmute your audio and just let me know that you can hear us, please.
Hi, thanks. Yes, I'm unmuted. Hi, John. It's really good to talk to you. I wanted to ask you two questions, really. I'm really interested in your thoughts on two things. One is about people. You just talked about the fact that people, a lot of companies will realize they don't need to maintain these huge offices and this huge physical infrastructure for people to be productive. And it looks like, the pandemic is going to make that a permanent change, although it may take some companies to realize that. Having said that, you've had to manage lots of large groups of people and keep them working and keep them motivated. What advice do you think you would be giving to managers right now about how to manage people during this time, and how to keep people who are, working in difficult circumstances focused on getting the job done?
David, I find it, I chuckle and I find it just so interesting when I read, and I read a lot, even though I don't work, I'm at my laptop about 12 hours a day working on something, and I'll check articles on different platforms, whether it's LinkedIn or others, and it's interesting that all the professionals and the smart people in the room are talking about a new focus on employees and a new focus on communications, and it just amazes me because I wonder what they did before. It starts and ends with people in my world, and that means that, whether it's the pandemic, which does place stress on people because we're social creatures and some deal with it a little bit differently than others, and I have children to deal with it differently than others. So I think the first thing that you do, and David, you're right. I mean, I worked in companies that were flying high, and I worked in companies where where it was red ink for 2 or 3 years, and I've seen the best and I've seen the worst, and I've seen it in different countries, and I will tell you that the magic elixir, and there's not one, but certainly the silver bullet is to communicate often and be very honest and transparent. I mean, and do it with empathy, but not contrived empathy. So you can't, I've worked for leaders who try to be nice, and you wonder, why are they treating me different today than yesterday? And that's really sad. And I think that's probably what's happening right now, is that, the HR and accounts people are pushing some leaders into the space of their employees remotely. And it's probably uncomfortable because they're not used to doing it 9 to 5 pre-pandemic. So what I would say is again, good leaders, there's some really, really smart people in certain industries that I guess can become a good leader, a successful leader. The companies do extremely well, the shareholders do well, and you haven't got to be the best person in the world. Most companies require us to be humans, to be open, communicative, empathetic, and really care about the people that work for us. And I think you do that through your natural interactions, but you certainly do it by being visible, transparent, sharing bad news as well as good, being honest, and at the same time, everybody that works for you, works with you, they understand that you're working just as hard as they are on a very common objective.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate that, and I think I agree with a lot of what you've said. The other thing that I wanted to pick your brain on is about content. We got a question earlier about whether the pandemic will cause telecoms to become commoditized. And it sort of strikes at the challenge that the pandemic is having right now. I mean, sorry, the telecoms industry has been having, where, you know, Mark touched on this earlier about the fact that all these edge providers, so-called OTTs, are, you know, they're making huge sums of money, but the networks over which they're making those sums of money are having to go into debt in order to finance their operation. And one of the things that companies, telcos, are having to do in order to stay relevant is acquire content, and it's getting more and more expensive. My question is about, you know, smaller operators who just don't have, you know, smaller operators don't have the sort of resources like an AT&T to acquire Warner Brothers, for example. Do you think it's for those types of operators spread around the developing world, it's just a question of when as opposed, you know, can they survive? Is it just a matter of, you know, when they will be either consumed by some larger operation or when they will eventually go out of business?
Yeah, I think a couple good points there. I will tell you that sort of the video business, for an operator perspective, is the lowest margin business, and in a lot of cases in precipitous decline over the last 10 to 12 years. And that's because the content costs, whether it's from ESPN or NBC or any other, continues to increase, usually every year or two. And so as much as consumers and regulators might cite increasing costs, I will tell you that in many respects, you know, part of that, or a large part of that, is borne by the fact that content costs continue to increase. And that's, I joked a couple of years ago that if I was starting a telecommunications company or a cable company now, I wouldn't even have I wouldn't have a video business. I would have the technology, I would have the ability to aggregate the Amazon Primes and the Hulus and the YouTubes and the Netflix and everybody else that's coming after them, but I would not even you know, deal with the main players. The main players, I guess one of the advantages that's still for the cable companies and similar you know, BDUs is live sports. And of course, that's taking a bit of a hit in the last 6 weeks. But as long as live sports remain part of the equation, it's very difficult for a cable operator not to sort of venture in and take those assets and to try to monetize them with a smaller margin. In terms of content acquisition and companies and sort of, you know, there's only so many, you're right, David, there's only so many companies that are large enough and have a balance sheet strong enough to be able to venture into content. And that's a very, very difficult venture as well. A lot of those companies are not doing that well. Netflix has a couple of 100 million customers or more, but I think their budget for 20 or 21 and something like $17 billion. And actually, if you go into Netflix now, they're doing a lot of sort of in-country productions, and the quality, no doubt, has come down a little bit. And it's been interesting how they challenge. I mean, it's a good model because it sort of brought in the geography content creation perspective. But no doubt, there's only so many movies can be made in series with Hollywood or even sort of UK quality levels. Yes, those smaller companies will eventually probably be consolidated if they exist in a geographic location that makes sense for to be brought into a bigger company. Content itself, I believe, will become, again, less and less relevant for some of the operators, and they will become aggregators. It will become, there's still a video content play there, but it's less on sort of the traditional cable model, and it's more on just being an aggregator. And again, I think if you are a customer, if you're any customer of a company now, and a lot of the cord cutters have gone away, but they are buying sort of from 3 or 4 different direct-to-home you know, consumer products. So they are replacing it. They're probably not sports nuts or some news nuts, but in the US and other places you can get that over the air anyway. But I guess what I'm trying to say is content. Mike Freeze, CEO of Liberty Global, when I worked there, he indicated we'll never be in the content business. We can't compete with Netflix. We can't compete with Amazon. And Liberty Global was at that time the largest cable company in the world. So I think it's knowing where your opportunities are, refining your business model, understanding if there is a niche. I was a big proponent, I still am, of course, of local content, regional content development. That's why I'm involved with another company. And I think that's where the opportunity is, to supplement these direct to company consumer products. But there's no easy answer here, David, except to say that costs continue to rise, and at some point companies will have to decide whether it's even worth that as their broadband business grows and replaces their video customer business.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, David, very much for your questions. So it looks like we have time for one more question here. This is coming from Antoinette. Hello from the Bahamas, she says. And the question is, does anyone's organizational or emergency response management plan or policy, have they made provisions for something of this nature? If you could address that to her. Thank you.
I'm not in the house anymore, Antoinette, but I have a feeling, and you would know certainly, because Bahamas, whether it's BTC or Cable Bahamas, would have emergency response teams and processes in place, and I know we did throughout the Caribbean. I don't think anybody can really, nobody would say they envision anything of this catastrophic level, because the interesting thing that there's no physical damage. So in some respects, that's a great thing. There's no houses like the massive hurricane that hit the Bahamas last year. There's nothing that's really taking infrastructure out. It's an interruption of, I guess, of life. And so, your emergency services then become, in some respects, they turn a little internally, I would think. They turn to, as David would have asked, they turn to your employees, or less than your customers, because your customers will still get the services. So your emergency responses, I would think, turn to employees and also turn to the quality of the services that they get, not so much the delivery of the service. Obviously, that includes how you deliver the service. I had a problem here with Atlantic Broadband in Miami a couple of weeks ago. Had supposed to be a guy coming into my condo. He did everything to try to resolve the issue remotely, which he did, thank God. I tried it myself, and he did, but they were doing everything not to have that technician come to my house. And even though I have a mask, he has a mask, the point is that it's created those kinds of situations. So I would think that it has less to do with sort of the normal crises that companies face. But I think at the same time, companies are smart enough and they've responded effectively enough with their employees, and also to ensure that customers still have the services on. That's where the attention has been, less so than sort of the disaster recovery. And at the same time, don't underestimate the importance of network management, traffic shaping, security, information technology, and all this, because that has probably become more of a crisis focus than the sort of service or the service that the external infrastructure that's normally handled, or that's normally the case when it comes to a more of a natural catastrophe.
Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
All right, so Sam, I think that's probably about it for us. I saw we had one more question that relates to network access points. Fortunately, John has agreed to come back and do a couple more of these with us, and we'll talk about that at a later webinar. We won't be able to get to it today. So I think, Sam, that about wraps us up. John, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for everyone who's participated. It's certainly been enlightening and very informative for me, and I've greatly appreciated everyone's contributions to this.